Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game that many of us played since our childhood. It's a home to many iconic monsters such as Blue Eyes White Dragon, Dark Magician, Egyptian Gods, Red Eyes Black Dragon, and many more. In the beginning we used to play the most powerful cards we could get our hands on, or just play our favorites. But somewhere along the way, archetypes emerged and made deck building more streamlined. Instead of just using the strongest monsters you had, you'd just use monsters that work well together because they were part of the same archetype. But what is the first time an archetype was ever released? That's what we are here to answer today in this theory video. I'm pretty sure the answer will surprise you, but before we get into the video, I'd like you to comment down below on which archetype do you think was the first one to be released in the TCG chronologically. Did you do it? Alright then, let's start with the theorizing. The first time we can clearly point out an archetype being released would be Gravekeepers in Pharaonic Guardian all the way back in 2005. We can clearly tell that all the members of the archetype are focused on working well together. They are obviously focused on revolving around having the Necro Valley up on the field to protect the graveyard and doing different stuff with each other. For instance, Gravekeeper Cannon Holder can tribute a Gravekeeper's monster other than itself to inflict 700 effect damage, and I mean any of the Gravekeepers. And Gravekeeper Spy can with its flip effect summon any of the Gravekeepers with 1500 or less attack from your deck. On the other hand, Gravekeeper's Assailant works with Necro Valley, and it can, while it's face up on the field, change the battle position of one of the opponent's face up monsters on attack declaration. The prime example of synergy in Gravekeepers is Gravekeeper's Chief, as it works well with Gravekeepers and Necro Valley, making it so that your graveyard is unaffected by Necro Valley and also summons any Gravekeeper's monster from your graveyard when it's tribute summoned. There are some oddballs in the strategy such as Gravekeeper's Vassal and Watcher, which have weird unrelated effects, and Gravekeeper's Guard and Soldiers that have unrelated but useful effects. To me personally, Necro Valley is the selling point of deciding that this group of cards is considered an archetype, as it gives Gravekeepers a clear win condition and a slight attack and defense boost. So if we can't find an archetype that was released before Gravekeepers, this'll be a very short video. However, you can probably tell by the time left on the video that we are just beginning. The first ever official Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG product released was Legend of Blue Eyes back in March of 2002. Cards in the LOB set were all released at the same time. However, if we go by the actual set number, there is one that pops out immediately. LOB/EN000 Tri-Horn Dragon has no archetype around it, but LOB/EN001 Blue Eyes White Dragon very much does. As the starter decks Yugi and Kaiba didn't come out in the TCG until later that month, it is fair to assume that Blue Eyes was the chronologically oldest monster to receive its own archetype. It would, however, make little sense if we counted archetypes retroactively here, as Blue Eyes could in theory be overthrown by a new Tri-Horn Dragon archetype at any point, and that wouldn't make sense. If we ignore the set number, some of the notable contenders here would be Ninjas with Armed Ninja, Skull Servant and Dark Magician with their namesake cards, Gaia the Fierce Knight and Celtic Guard, and maybe Flame Swordsman. Now the reason why I'm saying maybe Flame Swordsman here is to segue into explaining the difference between archetypes and a series of cards. By the definition of Yu-Gi-Oh! Wikia, a series is a group of 3 or more cards that share an appearance in artwork, name, or effect similarity, but are not genuine archetypes due to lacking any support cards. Series commonly but not exclusively comprise themed groups used by characters in the anime or manga. So despite you and I being able to make a deck focused solely around Flame Swordsman by using his fusion materials, equipping it with Salamandra, fusion summoning a Dark Flare Knight and special summoning Mirage Knight with its effect, and even using the blue Flame Swordsman and the new Link Ferocious Flame Swordsman, That group of cards wouldn't be considered an archetype, but a series of cards due to lacking a card like Necro Valley that keeps the archetype together. White cards such as White Aura Behemoth, White Aura Dolphin, White Aura Monoceros, White Aura Whale, White Moray and White Stingray, while being considered an archetype in the anime, are not considered an archetype in the TCG. The reason for this is much like Flame Swordsman, they don't have any unifying support cards released. Another curious case would be Legendary Fisherman, because even though Legendary Fisherman number 2 and 3 are working with each other, by 2 and 3 being summonable only by tributing the original, and number 2 being able to search number 3 on destruction, they are also in the gray area in between being an archetype of cards and a series of cards. Card series are not always this hard to differentiate, however, as you wouldn't think of elemental floaters such as Giant Rat or Mystic Tomato as being in the same archetype. You also probably wouldn't assume that the Hex Seal fusion cards are an archetype even though they share a very similar effect, because even though they support different cards, they do not support each other, but are clearly made with the same theme in mind. This is all important to say because, and I'm sorry to say Yugi No fans, but Larvae Moth isn't considered an archetype. It's a series of cards designed to evolve Petite Moth into its bigger stage, but it's just that, a series, because no unifying support cards were ever released directly for Petite Moth. Confusingly enough, its cousins Ultimate Insect 1 through 7 are a part of LV archetype even though they don't have anything in common thematically with other LV monsters. The only thing they share with, let's say, Horus the Black Flame Dragon is the LV gimmick, and yet they are considered part of the same archetype because they are unifying LV cards that support them. Now that we are aware of the fact that some cards are classified as series rather than an archetype, we should move on to Toons. As some of you might know, Toons are the archetype whose first members were introduced in Spell Ruler, or Magic Ruler, whichever you prefer, and that set came out before Gravekeepers did. That would make them an archetype that's older than Gravekeepers, if not for a small problem. Way back when they were released, the only Toon cards were Blue Eyes Toon Dragon, Toon Mermaid, Toon Summon Skull, Mangaruran and Toon World. The thing all of them have in common is the fact that while all having very similar effects, they all reference Toon World, but they don't reference other Toon monsters, apart from the part in the effect that states that they can attack directly unless opponent controls a Toon monster. As is the case with Gravekeepers and Necro Valley, Toons work together with the Toon World, and you could argue that that makes them the first archetype ever. Toons don't reference other Toon monsters in quotations in the same manner as the Gravekeepers do. The reason for that is that they are all, apart from the Toon Alligator, classified as Toon cards in the card text. This is a phenomenon exclusive to Toons, as other classifications Gemini, Spirits, Tooner and Union don't function in the same way. So that's it then. Toons are the first archetype ever, right? You could argue that the dependency on Toon World and referencing of it in the card text of monsters is enough to call them an archetype. And if that's your opinion, well, I think I might have a surprise for you. One set before Toons were released in Metal Raiders, there was a card released that is currently a part of an archetype. That card is Harpy Lady. You're probably aware that Harpy Ladies is an archetype at the moment of you watching this video, but the question we are asking is whether or not they were an archetype back then when they were released. At the time of the first Harpy Lady being released, two more members of the current archetype were released alongside it, those being Harpy Lady Sisters and Elegant Egotist. Elegant Egotist is a card that states that if there is a Harpy Lady on the field, you can special summon another Harpy Lady or Harpy Lady Sisters from your hand or deck. Harpy Lady Sisters has no effect, but it has a summoning restriction where it can't be normal summoned or set, and it can only be special summoned by the effect of Elegant Egotist. So the synergy here is clear, and apart from the vanilla Harpy Lady, other cards reference each other. Harpy Lady's Sisters is dependent on Egotist in a non-dissimilar manner to Toons and Toon World, and it's practically unusable without it. And the elegant Egotist can't even be activated unless there is a Harpy Lady on the field. Now one might say that these still don't consist an archetype at this point, because they don't reference other Harpy monsters in the same way as the Gravekeepers say Gravekeepers in the quotations, or the Toon monsters referencing opponents' Toon monsters. However, and this might surprise you, there are currently to this day no cards in the game that mention Harpy monsters by themselves. The gimmick of Harpy Lady cards is that most of them require you to use a Harpy Lady, and most of the monsters are treated as Harpy Lady while being in the graveyard, deck or on the field. Another contributing factor to the argument of Harpies being the first archetype ever is the fact that even before Metal Raiders there was a Harpy card. Harpy's Pet Dragon was released as a promo card for the game Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Memories. This bumps up the archetype member count at the time of the release of Metal Raiders to 4. However, there is another promotional card released at the same time that is worth mentioning. That card is Red Eyes Black Metal Dragon, which is clearly a part of the Red Eyes archetype. It states that it cannot be normal summoned or set and must be special summoned from your deck by tributing Red Eyes Black Dragon equipped with Metal Morph. However, in my opinion, this should be counted as a card series at this point because Metal Morph isn't a part of the Red Eyes archetype, and I would classify it as a card series in a similar way to Jinzo and Amplifier. So our research for now points out that the Harpies are the first archetype ever with only 4 members. If you think that that's not enough members to be considered an archetype, I'll just remind you that Toons only had 5 cards on release, and they are also one of the prime contenders. However, we are not done yet, as there is another archetype creeping in the darkness. An archetype so ancient and powerful that it predates even the known history. And that archetype is... drumroll please... the Forbidden One. That's right, back in Legend of Blue Eyes, the first set ever created, there was a set of 5 cards all sharing the same naming scheme. Right and left leg of the Forbidden One, right and left arm of the Forbidden One, and Exodia the Forbidden One. Out of all of those, Exodia is the only monster with an effect, while the normal monsters just hint at the effect with their flavor text. It's one of the most iconic creatures in the game, but was it an archetype on release? The unique thing about the Exodia cards is the fact that they have their own win condition, which used to be mentioned in the rulebook. That would imply that they were officially intended to be either a series of cards or an archetype. However, if you would take a look at the modern Exodia support and the modern Forbidden One support, you'd realize that those two are 2 separate archetypes. And due to Exodia the Forbidden One mentioning only the pieces of Exodia by name individually, I think it's fair to conclude that back in LOB, Exodia and the Forbidden One were not an archetype. You could disagree with me on this, so which one is it? Is it Blue Eyes? Is it Exodia? Is it Harpies, or maybe is it Toons? Or is it Gravekeepers as we assumed at the beginning? Well, in any case, I'll tell you my theory. My theory is that Toons were the first ever series of cards that were designed to be an archetype. I think that at that point Konami wanted to make archetypes but was unsure about the way of implementing them in the TCG. They opted to mark the archetype members such as Toons in the effect text box, but then later on decided that they wanted to retrofit some of the iconic monsters into a new archetype, and they didn't want to reprint the cards with an edited card text, or they just decided that they didn't want card to have so much text. That's the reason why Toons remain a unique case up until this day. They later on decided that archetype members should refer to each other in the quotation in their card text, very much in the same way as Gravekeepers did. But then later on they wanted to make Harpy Lady into an actual archetype, so they went back on that decision as well. At any rate, archetypes aren't officially referenced in the rulebook. Therefore, it's an unofficial term, and we can decide on our own which archetype was the first one to be made. So do you agree with my decision, or do you disagree? Let me know down in the comments below. Also, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing and checking some of my other videos. It really does keep me motivated to see you guys enjoying my videos. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!